also known in the history of political and social thought as the theory of regime. And next week, the subject is the ideal, the normative assumptions of the argument, the conception of human nature that informs it. So as I have said repeatedly in the course, structure, the institutional and ideological assumption of an established form of social life, is always the supreme object of political ambition. To maintain the yes, for the mic, is always the supreme object of political ambition. To maintain the established structure or to transform it in some way. And the explanation of structure, its explanation and justification, is also the supreme object of ambition in social and political theory. And this is a perplexing subject to discuss. It is perplexing because we have today no credible or usable theory of structure, as I have also repeatedly claimed at different points in the argument of the course. And if it is true that we have no usable or reliable theory of structure, then of course we can't wait for the development of our political activities and programmatic arguments for one to appear. And we have to find a way to make do without such a theory, to make up for its absence or its deficiency as we go along. I intend today to develop the argument in 3 steps. The first step is to once again place the problem of structure and its explanation in the context of the history of social theory and of social science. Because the historical genealogy of this problem illustrates the nature of the task that we have before us. In the second step of my argument today, I want to outline, to sketch, the rudimentary elements of a view of structure. Not a theory, not a developed theory, but what you might call a proto-theory. Some of the basic features that such a view of structure would have to include. And in the third and final step of the argument, I want to explore the implications of this view of structure, the view that I will now summarize in today's class, but have presupposed all along in the programmatic arguments, for the way we approach the problem of agency. Agency being how we think about the relation between alternatives, like the alternatives discussed here, and the social and political alliances on which their advancement depends. Now, before I begin to implement this 3-part plan, I want to return to the problem that I presented in the very first class of the course. The embarrassment experienced by anyone who in the contemporary world, in our world and in our historical epic, attempts to argue programmatically. Remember what I said then. I propose something that's distant from what exists now. You say that's interesting, but it's utopian. I propose something that's close to what exists now. You say, that's feasible, but it's trivial. So I suggested, almost anything that can be proposed in the current climate of opinion is likely to be dismissed as either utopian or trivial. And then I said, this false dilemma that threatens to intimidate and paralyze the programmatic imagination arises from a misunderstanding of the nature of a programmatic argument or a transformative practice. They're not about blueprints, which can be defined at points either far from what exists or close to what is established. They're about successions. They're not architecture, they're music. And any succession worth thinking about can be explored at points relatively far from what exists now or relatively close to what exists now. The problem is never moderation or extremism, how many steps we take at one time. The problem is the direction. That whatever steps we take them in the right direction. And the most important attributes of a programmatic argument are, first, that it define a direction, and second, that it select in a particular historical circumstance the initial steps by which to begin to move in that direction. Now then, I went on to add, the severity of this dilemma, its troubling consequences for us, is vastly increased by a feature of the history of ideas. The history of our ideas about structure, structural change, structural discontinuity, structural transformation. We have no good view of structure and structural change. We seem to have such a view in classical social theory, and especially for the progressives and for the left in Marxism. But as I shall soon remind you, that view turns out to be fundamentally deficient. And the assumptions of classical social theory about structure and structural change have now, for the most part, been replaced by a style of social science which simply suppresses the imperative of structural vision altogether. Now, what is the consequence for this dilemma of programmatic argument, of this absence of a reliable view of structure? What happens to us when we have no good way of thinking or talking about structural change? What happens is that we are compelled to fall back on a surrogate conception of political realism. Namely, that something is realistic if it approaches what already exists. And it is unrealistic if it differs from what exists. This false conception of political realism, in fact, nothing more than a declaration of intellectual bankruptcy, immediately results in the aggravation of that dilemma, that any proposal that can be made will be dismissed as either utopian or trivial. There is no good way to argue programmatically, to argue about alternatives, if we have no usable view of structure and structural change. There is an immediate connection between the ambitions of programmatic thought and the need for an approach to structure and to structural change. And that connection is then the heart of the problems that I want to explore today. Now then, let's begin with the intellectual historical context in which the problem arises for us. Classical European social theory had a view of structure. And what is especially pertinent to the left and to the progressives, Marxism, Karl Marx's theory of society and history. The consummate achievement of classical European social theory. Marx's approach to the problem of structure comes to a focus in his critique of English political economy. Marx said, the English political economists treated as universal and eternal the laws of what was in fact only a particular regime, the regime that he came to call capitalism. What they regarded as the universal regularities of economic life were simply the regularities of that particular form of economic life. At the heart of his approach to structure, there was a revolutionary insight. The revolutionary insight, stated now, not in his vocabulary, but in mine, is that the structures of social life are artifacts. They are made and imagined. They are not part of the furniture of the universe. They are not natural phenomena. They are our creations, our collective creations. Although what happens is that after we create them, they run away from us and reappear to us under the false semblance of natural phenomena. So we could elaborate this idea in the following way, radicalizing it in a way that Marx himself did not. There is in history an ongoing strife, a fighting, a practical and visionary fighting over the terms of our access to one another, of the claims that we can make on one another. This fighting is periodically interrupted, temporarily interrupted, or relatively contained. And the regimes or the structures, the basic frameworks of social life, are simply the residue of this temporary interruption and relative containment. So we could analogize it to a game of musical chairs. The music is the fighting, the practical and visionary strife. When the music stops, and it never completely stops, it just gets lower or is momentarily interrupted. We sit down on the chairs. The chairs are the structures. They are these temporary resting places in the endless strife of historical experience. That is the fundamental insight in classical social theory. And it has epistemic or consequences. As Vico already said in the 18th century, if we made these regimes, we can understand them in the way in which the creator understands his creation, from within, not from outside as we understand the atomic structure of a natural phenomenon. Now, this revolutionary insight that I've just summarized was compromised in classical social theory, and especially in Marx's theory of society and history, its highest expression, by a series of false assumptions or false ideas, which I would call the illusions of false necessity. And what are these illusions of false necessity? The first is that there is a closed list, a restricted menu of regimes or of structures. Marx called them the modes of production. The slave economy, feudalism, capitalism, socialism. They are the permanent menu of regimes in history, and under certain conditions they are enacted. But they're already there, behind the stage or off the stage of history, waiting for the right triggers for their enactment. So history has a script. And an important part of this script consists in the limited menu of possible regimes. The second illusion of false necessity is the idea of the indivisibility of these regimes or structures. Each of them is an indivisible system, which, when it changes, changes altogether or not at all. The very important practical consequence of this second idea, the illusion of indivisibility, is the binary view of politics. There are the two species of politics: the reformist management of a system, or the revolutionary substitution of one system for another. There is nothing in between. And this binary idea of politics stands in opposition to the idea that I defended in the course of our programmatic arguments, that that's not how structural change happens in history. The normal form of structural change is fragmentary, piecemeal, and can become revolutionary if it persists in a certain direction under a certain conception. The idea of the revolutionary substitution of one system for another is simply an idealized limiting case, and not the normal form of structural change. The third illusion is the historical laws illusion. History has laws which govern the foreordained succession of these indivisible systems or modes of production in history, and thus deepens the sense in which history has a script. Now, if history has such a script, in the sense defined by the third illusion, the historical laws illusion, it makes no sense for us to imagine transformative projects. History has a project for us. And any project that we attempt to conceive on our own is likely to suffer from the defect of voluntarism. It will be a voluntaristic or idealistic illusion in which we attempt to substitute our will for historical necessity. All the fundamental defects of Marxist theory have to do with these three illusions. Together, they discredit any programmatic proposal and misrepresent the nature of transformative practice. Now, in the conventional criticism of Marxist theory, the main burden does not fall on these three illusions of false necessity that I just enumerated. The main object is the main target of the traditional criticism of Marxism in contemporary social science has to do with the functionalist element in Marxist theory. So what is a functionalist theory? A functionalist theory is a theory that uses the consequences that something has as an explanation for its occurrence. For example, Darwinian natural evolution, the theory of natural evolution in Darwinism. The advantages of a certain form of natural life, a certain species, its competitive advantages are then used to account for its reproduction, its dissemination. So according to Marxism, each new mode of production, each regime, each structure emerges and spreads because it contributes to the maximal development of the forces of production. There always has to be a mechanism that transforms the consequence, that is, the functional advantage, into a cause. And in Marxist theory, that mechanism is class conflict. Each mode of production nurtures the development of a class whose class interest coincides with the universal interest of humanity in the development of the forces of production to the next stage. That's the mechanism of transformation. All functionalist theories are suspect because there's always this problem of
By what magic does the consequence become a cause? And are easily accused, as Darwinian natural evolution was, of being just so stories. But the truth is that the functionalist element in Marxism identifies something that's true. Some forms of social and economic life are more successful than others. There are advantages for the development of military or economic power do in fact help explain, if not their emergence, at least their dissemination. The problem does not lie solely in this functionalist element. The problem lies in the combination of the functionalist element with this deep structure view and with the illusions of false necessity. So, for example, one problem that arises in the critique of Marxist theory is that typically the same level of functional advantage in the development of the power to produce in the economy or the power to destroy in the development of military power. The same level of functional advantage can typically have alternative institutional foundations. There's never a one-to-one relation between the functional advantage and its institutional conditions. There are multiple possibilities. And these multiple possibilities are denied in Marxist theory. And what has happened then in the subsequent evolution of this classical theory of structure as we find it in Marxism? What has happened on the whole is that the theory has ceased to be believed in, or it is half believed in. There are very few people who are active defenders of the strong form of the original theory with these three sets of illusions that I described. But they nevertheless continue to use the vocabulary, the words, as if they believed in the theory. And the result is an enormous degree of confusion. The concepts of class conflict, of capitalism, the contrast between capitalism and socialism and so forth. All of this is enveloped in the climate of these theoretical assumptions and illusions. The words only have a precise meaning in their theoretical context. And the theoretical context has become the object of a kind of half-belief. So the characteristic attitude of subsequent theory, including subsequent leftist theory, is to dilute the Marxist claims. For example, by emphasizing the relative autonomy of culture and consciousness, or the relative autonomy of politics from this deterministic structuralist story, rather than to cling to the central revolutionary insight and radicalize it. against the force of the illusions of false necessity. Now, before I stop and ask for your comments about this first set of remarks on Marxist theory, let me go back to my initial comments on the false dilemma of the utopian and the trivial. I said, what's crucial is to have a sense of the direction and the initial steps by which to begin to move in that direction. Any programmatic argument worth entertaining or discussing can be defined at points that are relatively close or relatively far away from what exists. The direction is much more important than the degree of extremism in the pursuit of the direction at any given point. In a setting like this one, an academic setting, in which there is a premium on conceptual clarity, it will be natural in the statement of programmatic alternatives to emphasize points that are neither very close nor very far away from what exists, as I have done in the programmatic arguments of this course. Because that intermediate distance from the existent is likely to serve the purposes of conceptual clarification. But it has a great disadvantage in practical politics and in the discourse of transformative practice. The practical disadvantage is that these proposals at an intermediate distance from what exists are likely to seem too far away from what exists to be feasible, but not far away enough to arouse enthusiasm. And that is why in the language of radical politics, of transformative practice, it will be natural to avoid these proposals at an intermediate distance and to combine the very practical with the very distant. The next steps, the immediate changes in a particular context with the evocation of a faraway world, the practical and the prophetic. The discourse of practical politics, of transformative practice, is both practical and prophetic, as opposed to this intermediate level that I privileged here in the programmatic arguments that we've been exploring. Now, before I go any further, let me stop and ask whether there are any comments or questions about what I've said so far. Yes. Yes.
I remember in the beginning, or some of the initial chapters of the last alternatives, there was something about how like the process of elections oftentimes requires parties or people who are running to sort of cater the changes, like more practical politics of what they want to see changed to a specific audience. I mean, obviously elections are a very important part of how politicians implement social change.
Yes.
Structural. So how does one go about, and this is like probably an unanswerable question, but I'm just curious, how does one go about staying true to structural change while also catering to a political audience in order to be in a position to be?
Well, this has to do with the problem of agency that I'm going to come and at the final stage. But what I would say by way of anticipation, before getting into the details about agency, is that in this struggle, in this political struggle, it characteristically is necessary to offer solutions that have a double characteristic, that they solve some immediate problem, but that at the same time they represent a down payment on some larger trajectory of transformation. So they have to have an immediate practical impact on the solution of problems that people recognize as theirs, problems that they have now, and that they see as related to their material or moral interests. But then it has to have the second potential of being an anticipation of some change. So the prophet has to touch the wound. Humanity doesn't believe unless it touches the wound. But then that has to be seen as the first step in some transformative or redemptive succession, in some change. That's the general character of the problem. And that's related to this claim that I just made, that in transformative practice or political persuasion, we will normally have to connect the very practical with the prophetic and avoid precisely what I've emphasized here in the arguments, which is this intermediate level. So that imposes a requirement on whoever is listening or participating or trying to make sense of this, which is that in your mind, in one's mind, one has to be acting simultaneously at all these different levels. One has to imagine the proximate steps, what you do next. One has to imagine the ultimate direction, and thus I've often emphasized the long term. For example, in the discussion of a progressive political economy, and then the intermediate steps that connect the short term to the long term, because they have this potential for clarification. And that's a tall order, because it requires patience. And of course, in political practice, we need to be impatient. But in philosophy, we have to follow Wittgenstein's advice to the philosophers, which is take your time. Yes?
With respect to the supposed rigidness of regime types, you talked about how we use a small set of words to describe different types of regimes, and even though belief in that sort of theoretical underpinning is certain, and I'm curious, as we just, how would you propose, and maybe we can talk about this in the second half of class, but how would you propose discussing the different structures and directions we want to aim at without falling into the vocabulary trap of using words that make it clear that these things are inseparable, not mixable, not fluid?
As in, for example, how do you evoke the idea that structural change can be piecemeal by opposition to the binary view of politics?
And that it can blend ideas and not be, beholden to the sort of like either you're capitalist or you're socialist or you're something else. I think the vocabulary we use boxes in ideas, and at several points it seems like your argument for.
But there's a particular kind of boxing that concerns me here, which is this binary view that I described, that the structures are indivisible, and that you either manage them or you replace them all at once. That was the particular target of my complaint. And so I think the generic answer to your question is we have to try and be as precise as we can be about the theoretical assumptions of the words we use. So there's, for example, a radical confusion about the concept of capitalism. It's a system. Now, so I think when we're discussing the market order and its transformation, in any contemporary context, there's an elephant in the room. The elephant is the concept of capitalism. We have to lead the elephant out of the room right at the beginning of the conversation. Because if I start to discuss the reshaping of the market order, then you can immediately ask, well, is that capitalism? If we start to change the relation between labor and capital, between the backward and the forward parts of production, between finance and the real economy, at what point does, quote, capitalism turn into something else? That's an unanswerable question, because the question arises, in my view, from false theoretical assumptions. The assumptions that there are these fixed systems, which when they change, must change all at once.
Okay, thank you. That was exactly what I was
Sure.
asking.
Yes.
When Marx was writing about revolution, he was writing it in the aftermath of the French Revolution.
Yes.
Era, in a revolutionary era in lots of different ways, England, etc. Is the fact that today the prospect of a revolution and a kind of violent overthrowing of the status quo, the fact that that's faded, and the fact that we're now in such a globalized world where the idea that you could, in one of the liberal democracies, overthrow a regime and institute a new regime, that's also faded. So you've lost this idea of a kind of violent transformation,
Uh-huh.
and the idea that a regime in a democracy could be overthrown. Is that part of the reason for redefining what a revolution is? Because it seems a little bit like a retreat.
Well, so first of all, in this old idea of revolution, the idea that comes from the 18th and 19th century, there is a confusion. The confusion is between the notion of total change and the idea of violent change. So in the phenomenology of mind, in the phenomenology of spirit, Hegel had described the terror in the French Revolution as the expression of a frustration. That is, the terror was not the expression of total change. The terror was the expression of the impossibility of achieving total change by the methods that the French revolutionaries used. And Tocqueville, in his book on the Ancien Regime and the Revolution, had demonstrated how similar the France after the Revolution was to France before the Revolution, in opposition to this idea of total change. Now, if we go forward, still now responding to your question in a different way, there's the issue of what is the function of this idea of revolutionary change now? And I want to say the function has been to serve largely as an alibi for its opposite. This is the real function of the idea of revolution. So the disillusioned social democrat, the typical progressive politician in the Western democracies of today, thinks real change would be the substitution of capitalism by socialism, undefined terms. And that's not in the cards. It's not feasible. And if it were feasible, it would be too dangerous. So given that revolution, real change, is not feasible, what's left to do? What's left to do is to humanize the existing market order. For example, by compensatory redistribution, through progressive taxation and redistributive social spending. So this is a very important point to an understanding of the mentality of the contemporary progressives. They used to be Marxist, let's say, and now the disillusioned Marxist becomes an institutionally conservative social democrat. And part of the backdrop to this combination of resignation and presuppositions about revolution is this intellectual illusion. So I say this is no good. This is a confusion. It's an association of gradualism or fragmentary change with superficial change, and then this idealized notion of total change with the real thing. Well, the real thing is not available. And given that the real thing is not available, what's left to do? What's left to do is to humanize the world. And then we get to this fundamental attitude of many of the contemporary progressives, which is the humanization of the inevitable. And you can see how that's connected to a great deal of other things. So, for example, they abandon the supply side of the economy to the conservatives. And they say, so the market order, it is a device of wealth. We have no available substitute for it, for the creation of wealth, but we can humanize it. We can humanize it by sugarcoating it. And the sugarcoating will take the form of progressive taxation, redistributive social spending, and so forth. So what is being denied by that combination of ideas is the possibility that you could change the market step by step. You could have structural ideas, as in the themes that we've been discussing in the course, in the relation between the backward and the forward parts of production, the hierarchical segmentation of the production system, the relation of labor to capital, the relation of finance to the real economy. That's the real substance of a progressive political economy. The real substance is structural. But it's not structural in this old idea that there's an indivisible system which will be replaced by another indivisible system. So this is very significant to an understanding of all of our problems. It's a vital question that we achieve some level of clarity about these assumptions.
Where does that leave the idea of a revolutionary act then? Because it seems to me that in an era where violent revolution is more common, even if revolution as a whole is piecemeal, the potential for transformative change in a short period of time is greater. So take the Russian Revolution, for example, in Russia as a violent act which precipitated transformative change.
Uh-huh.
Is part of the reason that social democrats' possibilities are limited is because a whole lot of revolutionary acts are not available, such as violent revolution or other kinds of revolution in a globalized system where that would have such great, enormous economic consequences, for example.
Well, but I have to understand exactly what you're saying. So are you saying that this rapid transformation of structure is not possible because, for example, of globalization?
Partly. So for the humanizing social democrat, in the absence of levers to pull, like violent revolution, which is not,
Uh-huh.
100 years ago, some socialists would have conceived as violent revolution as being a means to enact transformative change. It's part of the retreat from revolution that those kinds of reforms are no longer.
Well, but the problem is we then have to deal with the details of these claims. So, for example, does globalization impose a straitjacket on transformative change? And you can remember from just the arguments last week, I was saying both episodes of globalization in modern history took place under the aegis of an idea of convergence. And in both cases, the idea of convergence was enforced by the discipline of capital, by a practical mechanism. So today, progressives in many countries say, we can't do this or we can't do that because globalization won't allow it. Capital will fly away and so forth. But we have only to look around the world and see that the present form of globalization is a particular form. It does impose particular constraints. It can be contrasted with another form of globalization. The most important debate is not the debate about how much globalization, but which globalization. But nevertheless, even within this present form of globalization, different parts of the world have responded in radically different ways to the same constraints. So the Latin American countries signed on the dotted line. They obeyed the instructions of the academic, political, and economic authorities of the North, and they suffered a precipitous decline in their participation in the world product, global GDP. The Northeast Asian economies, the tiger economies, and China took a completely different path. So I described the functional equivalent to the gold standard that the Latin Americans followed. Low level of domestic saving, dependence on foreign capital, openness of the capital account, and so forth, as opposed to what the Northeast Asians did. They created a fiscal shield for a rebellious strategy of national development, even within the constraints of the present form of globalization. So one has to look at the details and see whether all this fatalism is justified. And characteristically, it's not justified. Because even within the limits imposed by the present constraints, there are alternative possible responses. Now, that's not this idea of revolution, a somewhat fantastical idea of the change of everything. But it is on the question of the accessibility of structural change. Yes?
Another of Marx's theoretical assumptions, as articulated in the economic and philosophical manuscripts, is, in short form, essentially that human beings are laboring creatures, that labor defines human nature.
Yes.
I am curious about, firstly, the extent to which you support or criticize that assumption, and then secondly, if you do agree with it, what place it holds in your program?
Yes, well, I agree with it more than I think Karl Marx himself agreed with it. So I think that, so the idea to which you referred is we transform ourselves by transforming the world. Work has this transformative character. Now I remind you that Marx himself, in the introduction to the Critique of the Gotha program, like Keynes after him in Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, argued that we're on the eve of overcoming scarcity. And when we overcome scarcity, we'll be able to cast aside the hateful burden of work. The same work that has this transformative function, and we'll be able to devote ourselves to our private sublimities. We'll fish in the morning, and then we'll do poetry, and we'll do something else. Remember all of that stuff. And I said, in opposition to that, no, we're not about to overcome scarcity. Scarcity is endlessly reproduced in new forms. And no, it's not true that work needs to be simply a hateful burden. We can aspire to freedom in the economy and not just freedom from the economy. And that was a large part of the discussion. The dissemination of the knowledge economy beyond the insular fringes in which it now prospers, the transformation of the relation between the worker and the machine, No human being should be condemned to do the work that can be done by a machine, and so forth. So I think that's my response. I agree with the idea, but more than I think Marx himself agreed with it. Yes.
I want to go back to one of the illusions of false necessity being that like laws govern historical change, and I was hoping you would expand a little bit more about like what role you think laws play, and also kind of specifically, the fact that
Laws in the natural scientific sense, you mean?
Okay, sure. Well, I mean more in the political sense, like in the way that like these changes require political something. And specifically the idea that like obviously the left is not operating on its own, like there is also a right, and that like you talk in maybe the first or second class about like the Constitution, specifically the United States Constitution being extremely rigid and difficult to change, but also like I'm thinking about this is kind of nation.
Well, this is a different sense of law. These are our laws, the laws of the state, of course.
But sorry, the point I'm trying to get to specifically, and maybe it's too niche and you can say that and we can move on because there's a lot of whatever stuff time left in class, but specifically like on the right there's also a machine operating that has hopes and desires for changing the system. And so I wonder about things like opening up our political system to changes in law that could also be exploited on the right.
Of course, that's part of the concept of high energy democracy, that it exhibits its potency by its fecundity in structural change. But that depends, I want to argue, on institutional conditions. So what is a high energy democracy? A high energy democracy is a democracy that doesn't need crisis to make change possible, and is therefore able to overthrow the rule of the living by the dead. And what does it depend on? It depends on concrete institutional innovations. Innovations that raise the temperature of politics, the level of political engagement, of organized political mobilization. It depends on arrangements that hasten the pace of politics, the rapid breaking of impasse, and innovations that reconcile the facility for decisive action by the central government with radical experimental devolution to parts of society that can generate alternatives, alternative images of the national future. So the society hedges its bets, allowing parts of itself to secede from the dominant solutions and create counter models. That's a high energy democracy. And that leads to, so that brings then the discussion of structural change down to earth and asks, what are the practical conditions for the acceleration of this facility for structural change? And the most important domain in which that is defined is the domain of politics, which has a certain primacy over the other domains, including the economic one.
Right, but I guess my question is more about like what are the guardrails in place to make sure that that open system isn't exploited by those who don't have the best interests of the people at time.
So again, from a different perspective, this is another central idea that has recurred in our discussions. So the assumption that the primary emphasis of the contemporary progressives, what I call the institutionally conservative social liberals and social democrats, is that the individual must be secured in a haven of vital safeguards against public and private oppression, and a haven also of capability assuring endowments, abilities to do things, the economic instruments and educational instruments of empowerment. That's the emphasis of the contemporary social democrats. And this idea of the haven is a profound idea, a very important idea in any progressive project. But why do we create this haven? Why do we secure the individual in this haven? We secure him in this haven so that all around him there can rage a storm of innovation, of conflict, of experiment. And that's the part that's missing. So a large part of the programmatic arguments that I've been exploring in the course are about the storm. The storm doesn't arise automatically. The storm has to be arranged. And the one way of defining the heart of a progressive program is that it has to do with this relation, this dialectic between the haven and the storm. So I interpret your concept of the guardrails as being the haven.
I think more like, I'm concerned about the exploitation from like authoritarians and dictatorships inside of an open system. Like I'm thinking about like in whatever, in Turkey or in
Well, so for example, take this idea of devolution. So the conventional conservative idea is devolution is dangerous because the devolution of power to local authorities who would experiment with national alternatives is, we know from American history, it's states' rights. It's dangerous. It can be used as a device for the entrenchment of the privileges of certain classes or races, or for oppression. So obviously, the devolution has to be vetted, both judicially and politically. The political branches have to approve it. If there's going to be a wide divergence from the predominant national solutions, and there has to be a jurisprudence of these safeguards or guardrails, as you call them, to prevent abuse. But the object, nevertheless, remains to vivify this democratic experimentalism, because we don't achieve freedom simply from the guardrails, from the protections. We achieve freedom from the experiments, from the empowerment. And it's the relation between one and the other that's crucial. Yes?
So Marx wrote that reckonings in society, some of which we might today call crises, result from contradictions inherent in the dominant mode of production.
Yes.
Finding in political expression and mobilized social classes that come into conflict. I think my question is, does this have any kind of relationship, this concept of reckoning and perhaps historical contradiction, have any relationship with what you think of as a crisis today? Essentially, what do you think a crisis is? What constitutes a crisis? And are there historical laws or some kind of theoretical underpinning of why and when crisis occurs, as there is in a certain respect in Marxism?
No, I don't think there's I don't think that there's a stable or permanent theory of crisis, if that's the question. Because I don't think that these social systems, these structures, are like machines that obey permanent laws. I don't know how one would recognize, how one would identify the necessary and sufficient conditions for something to be considered a crisis. So, for example, take this problem in contemporary social democracy, in Scandinavian or European social democracy, that the willingness of people to make sacrifices for other people's children, to tolerate a high level of taxation for social entitlements, in a society in which there is a high level of ethnic, cultural, and religious homogeneity. So there you have an idea. The social cohesion is manifest by monetary transfers organized by the state against the background of a high level of homogeneity. Then suppose there are migratory flows, as there now are in Europe, and they erode this homogeneity. They then expose the inadequacy of money as a social cement. Money transfers organized by the state were never an adequate social cement, and their inadequacy or their limitations are exposed when the level of homogeneity is eroded. The only adequate basis of social cohesion, I would say, so let's say, is that a crisis? I'd say that's a crisis in a sense. A crisis is whatever exposes the functional limits of a system, its ability to cope. It is a crisis. And money is not enough. And if the level of homogeneity cannot be reestablished, the only adequate basis of social cohesion is direct engagement of people in one another's lives, direct responsibility for doing things with other people, the multiplication of forms of collective action. That's the only adequate basis of social cohesion. People doing things together, which they have never done before, motivated by common purpose. And then the state can help organize that, as we discussed. So that's an example of how a crisis arises in a situation which then leads you to a solution which has a transformative potential.
So if crisis is the exposing of a functional limitation or a series of functional limits of a system, I mean, it's my understanding that part of your progressive program is to make change and crisis independent, to cease the dependency.
To create, that's right, to create specifically with respect to the organization of democratic politics, to render the facility for transformation endogenous, to make it internal to the form of political and social life, so that we don't need crisis to provoke it or to serve as its condition. Trauma should not be the midwife of transformation.
I guess I feel like that inherent in your program, and I'm very much persuaded by this, but it's the constant challenging of current institutional arrangements, and potentially, I'd imagine, exposing their functional limitations.
Yes.
And so, I guess I wonder if that represents a kind of crisis. Maybe, is it sort of a state of constant crisis or managed crisis, or is this the wrong way of thinking about it?
Well, this is so this is very important, and this is something that can perplex, because it may seem that this is a theory of permanent revolution or permanent flux. And I wouldn't want to phrase it that way. So let me go back to a very abstract and general idea, just as an attempted analytical clarification of this problem. So there are two classes of activities, two classes of moves. There are the ordinary moves we make within a framework of arrangements and assumptions that we take for granted. Let's say those are the routine moves. And then there are the exceptional moves by which, from time to time, we challenge and change parts of this framework of arrangements and assumptions. Let's say those are the revolutionary moves. Now, the question is, what is the relation between these two classes of moves? So how distant are they from one another? And a pervasive feature of many of the proposals that I made, both economic and political, is that these two classes of moves should be brought closer together, so that the activities by which we challenge and change pieces of the framework arise more continuously and naturally from the normal business of life. and don't depend on these extraneous and exceptional events. So does that mean somehow that social life becomes more chaotic or described as permanent flux? I think the vocabulary is inadequate. It means that, in a sense, we're splitting the difference between preservation and revision. And what I would say is that a form of social life in which the contrast between these two sets of moves has been softened, has been effaced, is one in which we are freer. We are freer, we are greater, we are more powerful. And so that's a superior form of life. It is one of the dimensions of our freedom or of our empowerment that we should be able to engage in a form of life without surrendering to it. We should be able to engage in it in such a way that in engaging it, we continue to resist it. And we can then be insiders and outsiders at the same time. So that's a higher form of freedom. And I think it relates then to this, to a larger idea of our freedom, which is in the back of this, and which I would come to next week, but I can't anticipate now. So our self-construction is contradictory. It depends on contradictory conditions. And in particular, there are three sets of contradictions. So first, in the relation of the self to other people, we need other people, but they place us in jeopardy of subjugation, of loss of personal distinction. So the question is, how can we connect without being subjugated? And we have an experience of connection without subjugation in personal love, but what is the equivalent to personal love outside the sphere of intimacy? That's one large dimension of political debates. Then the second has to do with the relation of the self to a particular social and cultural world. We can't be free if we're isolated, if we're marginalized. We have to engage in order to be free. But in engaging, we run the risk that the world in which we engage will exact from us the price of surrender. So to be free, we have to be able to engage without surrendering. Denying the last word to the social world and keeping the last word for ourselves. And then the question is, what form of economic and political life will allow us to do that? And then there's a third dimension, which is the relation of the self to itself. So to be free, we have to form a coherent way of being in the world, a coherent form of being, a character, and its relation to the circumstance. The Greeks said character is fate. But we can't be free if we allow the character to suck the life from us and to become the rigidified substitute for the self. We become this persona. So we have to have a coherent way of being, and we have to be able to rebel against it at the same time, to disrupt it from within, because otherwise it becomes a mummy. And within this mummy, we begin to die. And our aim must be to die only once, and not to die in pieces, by installments. So we have to ask, what form of social life, what culture will allow us to become these people who can rebel against their own rigidified way of being? So that's how I see this larger program of freedom. So the conditions of self-assertion are contradictory, and there's no final resolution of these contradictions, but we can attenuate them. We can create the forms of social life that allow us to split these differences along all of these dimensions. That's the normative horizon of these arguments. And it's a way of elaborating the conception of human empowerment that underlies this. Now let me go back now to I've just begun really the presentation of this intellectual context of the present debates about structure in Marxism. And then we got into all of these debates, these very important debates. So what has happened in contemporary social science, to make a long story short? Classical social theory, Marxism, had an idea of structure, but it compromised its revolutionary insight through these illusions of false necessity that I just enumerated. And what has happened in contemporary social science? Contemporary social science has systematically suppressed and evaded the imperative of structural vision altogether. So let's take the example of the best organized and most influential social science, economics, to illustrate what has happened. So each social science has suppressed the imperative of structural vision in a different way. It's like Tolstoy's remark at the beginning of Anna Karenina. All happy families are alike, but each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. So the forms of unhappiness are, in the social sciences, are the different ways in which they suppress structural vision. Each one does it in its own way. So let's take the most powerful example, economics. How does it do it? Economics, so first of all, economics, again, is not the study of the economy. For a long time, economics has not been the study of the economy. Economics is the study of a method pioneered by the marginalist theoreticians at the end of the 19th century. The application of this method to subjects that seem to have nothing to do with the phenomena of production and exchange is considered economics. And the study of economic phenomena by some other method is not regarded as economics. Well, that's the university for you. That's the principle on which the university culture is organized. The forced marriage of methods to subject matters, very clearly illustrated here in the case of economics. And so how does this economics, suppress structural vision? In three different ways. So there are three different kinds of economics with respect to this issue. So first there is pure economics. Which makes no institutional assumptions at all, or causal assumptions or anything. The Austrians said it was more like a form of logic than a causal science. So it was formulated as a theoretical method that would be immune to normative and causal controversies. The only equivalent to it in the history of modern social thought is Hans Kelsen's Pure Theory of Law. And it is pure agnosticism and skepticism. So there's a theory, an analytical theory, and then there are models. And the economists, if one model doesn't work, you use another model. You change the elements of the model, or you change the values. It's like Groucho Marx said, I have principles, and if you don't like them, I have other ones. So this is the substitution of models against this empty theoretical structure. So that's pure economics. Then there's, which is a way of completely suppressing any structural discussion. So it was determined in the middle of the 20th century that the methods of marginalist economics could be applied to any kind of economy, including to a command economy. It had no restraints whatsoever. Then there's what you could call fundamentalist economics, as in Hayek's method. I said before, Robinson Crusoe trades on his island. If he trades long enough, he will eventually reproduce the whole system of 19th century German private law. That's fundamentalist economics. So it's the idea, rationality is identified with the market is identified with a particular contingent set of legal and institutional arrangements, the classical law of property and contract and so forth. And to this day, the practical economist generally thinks a market is a market, contract is contract, and property is property. All propositions which the jurists for over 100 years have known to be false. And then there's what you could call equivocating economics. Exemplified by the analytical practice of the American followers of Keynes, who took the political sting or poison from his theory and domesticated it. So Keynes's economics began as being a gesture in the direction of being a rival to this marginalist theory, but his American followers then downsized it, and they transformed it into the theory of fiscal and monetary policy. The pre-existing body of marginalist theory was relabeled microeconomics, and now there you can find them as two chapters in the same textbook, rather than as two rival theoretical paradigms. And so the macroeconomist studies law-like correlations among large-scale economic aggregates, like the levels of saving, investment, and employment. For example, there's a law governing the relation between inflation and employment, the Phillips curve. And then you dispute this proposition, saying that so-called law depends on a host of detailed institutional assumptions. Like, it depends on whether the workers are organized, whether there's unemployment insurance, what is the form of unemployment insurance. Change any of those background institutional assumptions and this law will vanish. And then what happens? The equivocating macroeconomist concedes, confession and demur, as the lawyers would say. But then in his analytical and argumentative practice, he disregards this concession. Because if de facto the institutional arrangements are stagnant in the society in which he's operating, he can disregard the concession that it depends on all of that stuff and go back to dealing with his law-like regularities. So now, this is just the beginning of a critique of this marginalist economics, because you could say it's developing more systematically a critique of this social science, you could say. First, it is empty of causal, factual, or normative assumptions. So it's a pure logical analytical machine which operates on the fuel supplied to it from outside, what I call pure economics. That's the first criticism. And it thinks it enjoys this advantage of analytic neutrality or immunity, but the result is that it is condemned to eternal infancy because it doesn't have the dialectic between theory and empirical discovery on which science depends. So that's the first fundamental defect. The second defect is its poverty of institutional imagination, including institutional imagination about the alternative institutional forms of the market order. I just illustrated that. The third defect is it is a theory of exchange entirely bereft of an equivalent theory of production. So classical economics before marginalism, Adam Smith, Karl Marx, had a theory of exchange and a theory of production of equal centrality. This economics has only a theory of exchange. It views production under the lens of the theory of exchange, the relative prices, and it's made possible by a contingent fact of these economies, that in them labor is bought and sold. And the fourth defect is that it is a theory of competitive selection bereft of any theory about the creation of the diverse stuff on which the mechanism of competitive selection operates. So, for example, from the standpoint of this economics, the world might just as well not be divided into separate economies and separate sovereign states, because the existence of sovereign states with their different laws is a practical embarrassment, transactions costs, and an analytic embarrassment. It has no proper economic significance. So it's as if you had the neo-Darwinian synthesis, the combination of evolutionary theory with the theory of genetic without the other half of the theory of genetic mutation and recombination. The fecundity of a method of competitive selection depends on the richness of the material from which it selects, but there's no theory of the creation of this diversity in this economics. So those are all the defects of this science, so-called science, the pseudoscience. But it is an example of how a particular social science, the best organized, the most influential, suppresses the imperative of structural vision. And that's what happens in all the social sciences. So there we have what the problem is. Now, we have a classical theory of structure, which has a revolutionary insight that it eviscerates, that it limits. And then we have the contemporary social sciences that conduct a relentless campaign against the imperative of structural vision, each in its own way. So the result is we have no theory of structure. We have no regime theory. We have no theory of the change of regimes, of structural discontinuity, of structural alternatives. That's the intellectual background to that false dilemma that I described at the beginning of the class today. Now, what then are some of the elements I call the proto-theory, a minimalist theory of structure and structural change? Not a theory, but some of the standards or the criteria with which an acceptable answer to the problem of structure would have to meet. So, first of all, what is a structure? What is a regime? It is the formative context, the formative framework of a form of social life, shaping the routine conflicts at the surface, and especially the conflicts over the way in which we use the resources of political power, economic capital, and cultural authority to create the future within the present. A structure shapes its own sequel and shapes the surface of social life and resists change. But now comes the second point. A structure is not a system. It's not indivisible. its different parts reinforce each other, and they do exert power over their succession, over their sequel, but it's not an indivisible package that stands or falls all of a piece. Now, how are these structures formed? They're formed from the contingent materials of historical succession. The elements by which we form these structures, the institutional elements and the ideological elements, are not picked from some laboratory, from some menu of the options in history. They're picked from what's visible and available in the historical circumstance. And there is, as I said, this functionalist element, that some of these structures are much more successful than others, but there's no one-to-one relation between a level of functional advantage and its structural presuppositions. The same level of functional advantage of economic success or military success, for example, can have alternative institutional foundations. Now then, another thing to say is this. When there is an innovation, a set of innovations in the world, like the technological innovations that are used by the knowledge economy, the tendency is for them to be assimilated and implemented in the form that least disturbs the ruling interests and the established preconceptions. And we could call that the path of least resistance. So the path of least resistance is the way of developing structural innovations that take advantage of these innovations with least disturbance to the dominant interests and preconceptions. The path of least resistance has an advantage, which is that it minimizes disturbance. But it also has a disadvantage, which is that it tends to underutilize the transformative potential of the innovations. The insular knowledge economy that exists today is a characteristic example of the path of least resistance. The enemies of the path of least resistance, who are the progressives, have something on their side, which is this failure of the path of least resistance to exploit to the hilt the potential of the innovations. The potential is understated, is repressed by the path of least resistance. Now, there's another feature in the variations of structures of regimes in history, which is disregarded or understated by the classical theory of structure, as in Marx's theory of structure, Marx's theory of the modes of production. And that is that unlike natural structures, these human structures exist more or less. There is a variation in the sense in which they exist. They can be, a structure can be organized in a way that entrenches itself against challenge and change, or on the contrary, it can be organized in a way that facilitates its own revision. So a structure can be surrounded by a series of protections against its transformation, including ideological or conceptual protections, can be regarded as natural or sacrosanct. and in this way immunized against challenge and change. Or on the contrary, it can be organized in a way that, in which it robs itself of this pretense of naturalist necessity and authority. Now, what I want to say is that the superior structures, going back to that idea of bringing together the two classes of moves, the ordinary moves that we make within a framework and the exceptional moves by which we challenge and change pieces of the framework. The superior structures have this characteristic of disentrenching themselves, of laying themselves open to challenge and change. So let's put this in the context of a difference between our situation and the situation of the liberals and socialists of the early 19th century. So the liberals and socialists of the early 19th century believed that there was a particular institutional dogma, a particular path, which would guarantee both our emancipation from entrenched schemes of social division and hierarchy and the development of our practical capabilities. So John Stuart Mill, Karl Marx, the liberals and the socialists said, follow this path and you will be both rich and free. As if there were a kind of pre-established harmony or natural convergence between the institutional conditions for the development of our material interests and the institutional conditions for the achievement of our moral interests. Now, we are tempted to embrace the equally dogmatic but inverse dogma that there is a tragic contradiction between the institutional conditions for the pursuit of our moral interests and of our material interests. But it would be better to imagine that there is some zone of possible intersection. In other words, there's some subset of the institutional conditions for the development of our moral interests that also satisfies the institutional conditions for the development of our material interests, and vice versa. And what do we then want on this view? What we want is to travel in the zone of potential intersection between the institutional conditions for the development of our material interests and of our moral interests. Now, what is the essential attribute of arrangements in this zone of intersection? It's precisely the one I just stated, that they lay themselves open to challenge and change, that they have this character of being experimentalist. And you could see intuitively what the reason for that would be, that institutions that have this faculty of untying our hands would serve our material interests. They would allow us to combine everything with everything else, and they would serve our moral interests because the essential basis of any entrenched scheme of social division and hierarchy is that it be immunized against constant challenge in social life. So this is all for the purpose of claiming a contrast between our situation and the situation of these 19th century liberals and socialists. Like the early 19th century liberals and socialists, we have a stake in affirming the primacy of structural alternatives. And unlike the institutionally conservative social liberals and social democrats of today, with their emphasis just on humanization of the established order. But unlike those liberals and socialists of the early 19th century, we also have an interest in resisting and trusting our futures to dogmatic institutional blueprints. So we have a task without historical precedent, which is how to affirm the primacy of structural alternatives without succumbing to a structural dogmatism. And that is why many of these proposals that we've been discussing in the semester have this character of exemplifying and promoting experimentalism. That is, they are the inclusive knowledge economy, the high energy democracy, the alternative form of education that is dialectical as well as analytic. They all have this character of allowing us to focus on the underlying structural realities, but without confining us in a structural dogma. Now, one more step in this three-step argument. I discussed the historical background, the proto-theory of structure, the elementary assumptions about structure which we need to presuppose. What about the implications for agency? What I said would be the third step of my argument. And those implications for agency can be summarized in three propositions. So the first proposition you could describe as the correspondence thesis, which is that every programmatic argument can be always stated in two equivalent forms. One form is as a proposal for a certain succession of institutional and ideological changes. The other is the proposal for a certain kind of coalition, a certain union of social and political forces in society. And these two expressions of a proposal are, I think, just the reverse side of each other. Every powerful programmatic idea, every powerful project of change has to build its own constituency over time. It doesn't simply rely on an antecedent constituency. Now, the second proposition is what you could call the asymmetry thesis. And I want to state it now in its most contentious form. So the idea is that a political alliance, an alliance of political forces and opinions in favor of an alternative, does not presuppose an antecedent class alliance. It has to construct such an alliance. But the class alliance, the social alliance, does presuppose the political alliance. This is this idea that the project has to build its own constituency over time. Now, the justification for this asymmetry thesis lies in the third proposition, which is the most important of these three ideas about agency. And this is what I want to call the duality thesis. And once again, let me define it by contrast to the Marxist idea of agency and of class conflict. So, in the Marxist theory, class interests have an objective content. And the more intense in force and the broader in scope class conflict, the more the objective character of class interests becomes manifest. The interests of a class are defined by its place in the current mode of production and by its place in the historical sequence of modes of production. And what I want to say is that this is the exact opposite of the truth. The idea that classes have an objective interest is an illusion dependent on stagnation. The broader the scope of conflict and the more intense the force of conflict, the harder it becomes to separate the question, what are my interests as a member of a certain class, from the question, what would be the alternatives? And who would I become under each of these alternatives? And what would then be my interest and my identity? So the duality thesis is the claim that every class interest can be defined and defended in two distinct ways. In a direction that is institutionally conservative and socially exclusive, and in a direction that is institutionally transformative and socially solidaristic. For example, now to take the example that has exemplary significance for the progressives, because it has to do with their core historical constituency. The workers, the organized, stable labor force headquartered in the capital-intensive sectors of the economy, and especially in mass production industry. That was the historical constituency of the left parties in the West. Now, how are they to define their interest? So they could say, and this would then exemplify the institutionally conservative and socially exclusive way of defining and defending the interest. Our interest is to dig ourselves into our present niche in the division of labor, to defend conventional mass production industry against all threats, and to buy a few more years for it by subsidies, by restraints on plant closures, by restraints on subcontracting of work, and so forth. And in that project, the groups that are closest to us in social space, the foreign workers, the temporary workers, the small business class, will be our enemies. That's what I'm saying is the socially exclusive and institutionally conservative way of defining and defending the class interest. But there's always another way in which the leaders of the workers and the left parties could say, this form of economic life has no future. It's a sinking ship. Our interest is to transform it into something else. An instance of the knowledge economy. The Rust Belt industries have to be transformed into versions of the knowledge economy, or they have no future. And in that exercise, the groups that we used to think of as our enemies, the small business class, the temporary workers, the foreign workers, have to become our allies. That's the alternative way of defining and defending the group interest. And this, you'll notice, is the exact inverse of the Marxist theory of class interest. And it depends then on an effacement of the clarity of the contrast between the debate about interests and the debate about alternatives. Now we have run out of time, our legitimate time, with the additional 15 minutes. And so let's start the next class rather than by going directly into the philosophical discussion with some discussion of these propositions about agency and about structure. And I ask you to come equipped with questions and comments for that discussion.